In this next set of slides, we'll talk about CSS layouts using floating grids. We'll discuss floating elements, centering using margin, and building a simple grid system. Floating allows us to create column structure by pushing an element either to the left using float left or all the way to the right using float right. In this example, we have a header and a footer, and in between are a sidebar and a main content section. By telling the sidebar to float left and the main section to float right, we're able to position them side by side horizontally. Here you can see the code to accommodate that floating. So here the sidebar has an ID of sidebar and is set to float left. So here we're using the CSS float property and setting its value to left. And then for the main content section, we've given that an ID of main, and we've set the float property to the value of right. Now it's important to know that whenever you float something, it will affect all of the elements below it. So by default, any element that's below a floating element will try to pull up next to it if there's room for it to fit. For example, if we float our main content to the left and our sidebar to the right, let's say we have a footer below it. If there's room for that footer to fit next to the main content, it's going to jump up and try to sandwich itself just below the sidebar. Fortunately, we can tell an element that's misbehaving to clear past the height of any elements that are floating above it. And the way we do that is by using the CSS clear property. Clear can accept a value of left to clear past the height of anything floating to the left, or a value of right to clear past the height of anything floating right. And you can also say both to cover all your bases, which will make sure that this element, in this case the footer, clears past the height of anything floating to either the left or the right. You can see after we apply that code, the footer actually clears then down below. Let's take a look at a practical example using floats. So here I have a paragraph, and then below it I have an image, and that's followed by 4 paragraphs. Now let's say, for example, that we would like to have these paragraphs wrap up around the side of this image. So anytime you have an element in HTML that you would like to act more like a column, and you'd like the content below it to actually wrap up around it, you can set it to float. In order to do so, we can select the image, and then we can set its float property to either left or right. So here we'll set it to float left, and you can see when I float this image to the left, all of the paragraphs that are below the image are trying to pull up next to it and wrap up around it. This is really what floating was meant for. Now you can see that I can also set it to float right. And the difference there is then the image will jump over to the right side of the page, and the content will then pull up next to it on the left side. So again, we'll go back to float left. So let's also set a margin around this image to give it a little bit of space on the right side and the bottom. So here we'll use the margin property, and we'll set it with 4 values. So 0 for the top, and then we'll say 20 pixels for the right, 20 pixels for the bottom, and 0 margin for the left. And that'll give us a little bit of a space here. Now let's say, for example, that we're happy that these 2 paragraphs here are actually appearing beside the image. So these would be the first 2 paragraphs here underneath the floating kitten image. However, we would like the 3rd paragraph and the 4th one to actually fall below and appear below the floating element. In order to do so, we've created a class called fallBelow here, which is just a generic class name we've invented. And we're going to apply that to that 3rd paragraph there below the image. And let's go ahead and write a selector for that. And then we're going to use the CSS clear property and set it to clear both. And this is going to tell this particular paragraph here to clear past the height of anything floating above it. So you can see when we apply the clear both, this 3rd paragraph then behaves and falls below our floating element here, which is the kitty pic. One of the main things to note about float behavior is that floating doesn't affect elements above it. So this 1st paragraph here is completely unaffected by the floating image. However, anytime you float an element, it always affects all of the elements below it to try to pull up next to it when there's room. And again, we can set elements to clear both if we want to set an element to not pull up next to a floating element and actually clear past the height of that floating element, as we did so here.